Good morning. I'm Rachel Howes-Binnington, one of the co-coordinators and field archivists for the AIM25 Yerusha project Mapping Jewish London, and I'm here this morning with Howard Falksohn from the Wiener Library and Holocaust Center. I was wondering if you could give us a bit of background about the history of the Wiener Library and the scope of your collections.
Yeah, so the Wiener Library started its existence as the Jewish Central Information Office back in the 1930s. So it wasn't actually a library or archive at the beginning. It was really an information gathering bureau whose remit was to document the growing anti-Semitism initially in Germany, then later throughout the rest of Europe. So the basic principles of gathering and collecting information weren't quite the same as they have been since the post-war era. It's really since 1946, after the end of the Second World War, that the library started to process its materials in such a way that's a recognizable and archival and library way. So that now we've grown over a period of 80 years and we continue to grow and collect new materials. During the war years, we worked principally for the British government. We supplied information for various departments within the government. In fact, we even allowed members of the British government to borrow original materials, which today would be a complete anathema. But such was the urgency of prosecuting the war effort and our desire to want to be of assistance to the British government in that respect, that we allowed that to happen. In the aftermath of the Second World War, we were involved in projects such as the gathering materials, original materials and records that would help prosecute those involved in the Nuremberg war crimes trials. We also helped with restitution claims. And finally, one of the other big projects that we were involved in was the proactive seeking out of original testimonies from those that had survived the Holocaust and the refugees.
And so in addition to materials from the Holocaust, what other materials do you collect and what other focuses does the organization have?
I'm particularly interested in not just in material that documents how people were persecuted and ultimately, were killed and destroyed, but I'm also interested in how communities thrived before the Nazis came into power. So we've got many collections that well predate the Nazi era, and some of our collections, quite a number of our collections, will go back to the 19th century. And in fact, we've got one particularly interesting collection that goes right back to the 18th century. So I'm very much interested in that. And so quite often our donors, when they approach us in the first place, they kind of assume that we're only really interested in the Nazi era and the Holocaust. And I have to make it clear that actually, obviously that's of interest to us, but we're also interested in anything that predates that. And our kind of collecting remit is fairly all-encompassing. So we'll take school reports, we'll take vaccination certificates, we'll take all sorts of what materials that might seem fairly kind of innocuous, but because not that much survives from those communities, we're interested in taking everything.
The library is based in London, and you're an active member in AIM25. How important is that membership to AIM25 and what AIM25 does to you personally as an archivist, but also to the collection?
Well, AIM25 was one of the first portals that the library got involved with. And so in that sense, it has been really important because it's basically, it's publicized our holdings in a way that as a small institution with a name that doesn't really signify anything or didn't, it enabled us to really reach out to a much broader audience. And I can remember in the early days when we've had basically we got 550 collections at collection level uploaded fairly early on. It's going back to about 2007 now. And so we had there was a team of indexers came in from AIM-25 had to re-index according to their own thesaurus terms. And I can remember in the early days, you were able to search the number of hits, not just on each collection, but on each subject term that was being searched for every month. So you could gather statistics, and they're literally thousands of hits a month. We were always one of the, I don't know, the top 5 or 6 search collections. So, when I first started at the library, all we had was a card index and a few scraps of paper, which with really minimal descriptions to the archives. So we've come on absolutely leaps and bounds since then. So I think it particularly benefits a small institution like us, which didn't have much publicity or didn't have much of a footprint out there. And of course, those collections now, those descriptions have been duplicated into other portals. So you've got the Archives Hub, you've got the Discovery, but you've also got ERI, which is the European Holocaust Research Initiative, which is specifically Holocaust related, but they're also using our descriptions on a Europe-wide portal.
So when Jeff came to you and asked you about participating in the steering committee for the Yerusha bid through Rothschild Hanadiv, what was the immediate interest to you, both as an archivist and as the caregiver for these collections?
Yeah, I mean, it made sense in that, insofar as a lot of our collections do relate to Jewish experience, especially in Europe, and so it doesn't surprise me that much to know that we're probably one of the collections in the UK that has more relevant collections to this project than most others.
From a COVID standpoint, whilst the collections have been closed, have you been able to go in to the collections and pull material to do kind of cursory research for people? Or is it very much, these are the resources we have? Are you booking ahead for users to come in?
It's really depended on what the level of lockdown has been. There have been times, especially early on, where I was the only one going into the building. In a sense, there was no real danger there. I mean, I cycle in anyway, so I don't have to use public transport, and I wasn't really coming across anyone, so it's actually quite safe. So I was able to do a certain amount of document research and document delivery orders. So one of the collections I've been working on is something I can do at home, which is basically an audio collection. And I've only just recently completed that. It took about 4 months. So I had to listen to several hundred hours of recorded interviews, which was really interesting. And it actually did bring to mind what it means to be Jewish, actually, because so many of our, the refugees and the people that we come across came from very assimilated backgrounds. So when you talk about Jewish, what do you mean? So, and of course, many of them are non-practicing, whereas this collection kind of brought to light really the extent to which that is the case. So many of the interviewees may have come from strong Hasidic backgrounds where their parents had been very observant. But these people had either completely abandoned their Jewish heritage, or they became just kind of nominal in their observance. So they may just go on the high holidays and that kind of thing.
I'm glad you brought that up, because it's an issue that we were discussing very early on, I think at one of our first steering committees, about how do you handle the assimilation question, especially if somebody chooses to leave the faith or just doesn't acknowledge it as part of their existence. And yet we're going out and we're trying to highlight their Jewishness. And it's almost like they've wanted to forget it. How do you do that without retroactively outing someone from something they've tried to forget? In a weird way, it's kind of a combination of cultural PTSD and cultural amnesia, but the opposite of what would be the opposite of amnesia, hypernesia. Like we're trying to go back in time and make them remember or make the material remember that they were Jewish. So you have to remember you were 5 and you went to shul with your grandfather. It's here in the record. The record says you're Jewish.
the collections that we deal with range in from the one extreme where you may get one or two quite orthodox believers, but very few, I would have to say, to people who may have had Jewish heritage, but it means nothing to them whatsoever anymore. So a classic example is a brother and sister came on a Kindertransport. The boy was sent to a Catholic school, became a Catholic priest. The girl was sent to a Catholic school. She became an ordained nun. The father, he converted to Catholicism in the early part of the 1900s out of conviction because he just wanted to, became a senior high court judge. And his wife, she also from a Jewish background, chose to become Catholic for more pragmatic reasons during the 1930s, because she thought it might help them in some way, shape or form. But there you got a family that's, Judaism or being Jewish has relatively little meaning for them, only in the sense that they were persecuted because of their heritage. So the mother and father, they managed to survive miraculously, hiding in plain sight in Vienna throughout the war, and managed to actually survive the war. The two children, like I said, were sent over here and became a priest and a nun respectively. And so, but because they were persecuted for their Jewish heritage, that's why we've got their material, and that's why it was of interest to us. There are very few collections of families who maintained a strict Orthodox, observant lifestyle.
Do you think that has more to do with the nature of and the process of immigrating? If you don't have a community to go into when you're leaving your home community and then migrating across? Or do you think that that's just the nature of people who leave home, and maybe they're leaving home because it is too restrictive or too prescriptive?
Some Jewish children, for example, who came on a Kindertransport, they were specifically housed with observant Jewish families, with the intention of trying to maintain their Jewish identity and all the rest of it. The extent to which they achieved that is probably mixed. I don't know. Others were sent because they were going to go to Palestine, so they came to farms in England, Hashara. So they were prepared for Palestine, and they came from more Jewish Zionist political backgrounds where religion played less important role, but Zionism and the state of going to Palestine and making a life there was a much more important part of their role. Of course, many of those never got there because the war broke out, and of course many of those actually ended up marrying non-Jewish English men and women. So already it became watered down, their sort of Jewish heritage. So it's very mixed. And if you look at we have a lot of material on the Kindertransport. And if you look at the kind of, if you studied more closely the experiences of many of those children, it's very, very differentiated. There's no one typical sort of experience. They're all very different. Some had a terrible time, really actually almost abused and all the rest of it. Others had entered very loving families and were sent to, boarding schools or grammar schools, had very good educations and became very successful. So it is very different and very varied. But I would say a lot of those, regardless of how successful they became, they probably lost a lot of their Jewish identity and heritage as a result, like you say, partly of being physically having to move home, but also where they ended up, where they landed.
Yeah, I know in the U.S. what we tended to see were a lot of burial societies being formed first, because the idea was that if you couldn't live as a Jew, at least you could die as one.
Yeah.
And that there would be at least two other people in town. You may not be able to make a minyan, but at least that you got as close as you could get, the hope being that God would understand. So with something like this larger plan for the Yerusha database, do you see it as, I think it's a very positive thing. I hope it has traction. and that it manages to go on. But how does the idea of an international database of this magnitude sit?
Well, certainly, because we're collecting material all the time, new materials coming in all the time. So potentially, we would always have more material to contribute. It's like with any sort of portal or database like this, it's all about exposure, isn't it? It's about exposure of collections. Because if you think most archives, if you go back 50 or 60 years, most archives were very inaccessible. And you made the point about the gatekeeper. Well, archivists had great power, didn't they? Because they could control who had access to what. And so if they didn't like the look of somebody, they could say, oh no, we haven't got that, or no, you can't come in. The whole thing about digitization and the thing about portals and the Urushi Database, for example, is an example, is all about opening up access, broadening access, and making collections more widely known. And it's not just the preserve or the remit of a few select, elite scholars who've been, kind of got, special dispensation, they can access this material. It should be much more widely available. And I think that's the way we're going. I think other countries probably dragging behind, partly because they haven't got the resources to process their collections and make them available. But still, I think there is a kind of mentality amongst other institutions where, oh no, if you really want to access this, you've got to come over here and you've got to, book a seat in their reading room, and they don't make it easy, put it that way.
It's one of the things that I'm hoping will be a positive outcome of this whole COVIDity experience, especially for institutions that are kind of small and scrappy and, are hard to get to, but also nationals who say we don't have the ability to prioritize or fast track. It's like, actually, if you step back and you look at what your remote offerings are, you increase your user numbers tenfold.
Yeah.
And then you get the people who really need to come in and look at material on site because they're going to miss something in the context or the engagement with that material in a way that just looking at something online doesn't give you. I mean, if you're in Australia and you have family material that's been donated to the Wiener Library, it's going to be infinitely easier to sit down and listen to these recordings or go through the large digital assets that you've now managed to put online for them to decide if they actually have a need to come immediately.
Yeah, exactly.
And I just feel like that's what makes our job so great, when we can cross that divide. And I do think that we had the best, I think we've managed, the fact that we managed to hit our data set numbers with this project is, I think, a testimony to just stubborn, scrappy go-getting. But the fact that people or organizations like yours were able to provide data for us so quickly, when what we had initially been offering you was the services of a field archivist to come in and help process your backlog, because we all know the backlog never gets smaller. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
With material that you contributed that was not identified initially as Jewish, is that a surprise to you? Because I would assume, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, that most people make the assumption that if it's in your library, it is somehow tangentially or otherwise linked to Judaism.
That's right. And our remit is to collect and make accessible material that pertains to people who are victims of the Nazis. So that would already include a whole bunch of other victim groups. But it just so happens that the vast majority, overwhelming majority of our collections do pertain to people who have Jewish heritage. I mean, we've got one collection that, quite a famous one now, that pertains to a black mixed race family. And we've used that in exhibitions and stuff. And it's an amazing collection, because not only for what it is, but the quality of the content. We've got fantastic audio, great photographs, and really interesting documents and memoirs and what have you, all part of this one collection. So, but that's a one-off. That's the only collection that we've got on that. And then there's another larger collection on Sinti and Roma. But again, it's kind of more secondary material rather than primary. And in a sense, I mean, the Sinti and Roma were a massive victim group in the Holocaust, and but because, I mean, there's probably various reasons why we have got relatively little primary source material on Sinti and Roma, and it's probably partly to do with the fact that the literacy rates amongst Sinti and Roma were a lot less. So a lot of our collections contain copious correspondence, reams and reams of correspondence, because many of our victims came from sort of very kind of educated, erudite, middle-class Jewish families, and so they wrote. There was no email, there was no, mobile phones in those days, so people just wrote to each other. So we got tons and tons and tons of correspondence. Whereas you can say, well, Sinti and Roma, maybe that wasn't part of their culture. Maybe it's much more of an oral culture. So nothing's been recorded. But so we've only really got this one collection that documents the fate of Sinti and Roma, which is a tragedy in a way when you consider how much they suffered also during the Holocaust.
And when you consider the fact that there's still a lot of out and out racism and bias against the Sinti and Roma community that still persists.
Exactly.
We haven't gone out of our way to make them feel welcome.
No, exactly. They are still persecuted in some countries, massively so.
So what are the Wiener Library's plans going forward, kind of immediately post-COVID? When do you guys anticipate, I know it's got to follow government guidelines, but when do you anticipate being able to open back up to researchers and
Well, we are very soon, actually, very soon. We're talking about in middle of April, but it's actually, we're definitely going to open up, but the question is how long we're going to be open for, whether it's going to be a sort of part-time thing, or whether it's going to be back to the full 7 hours a day, 5 days a week, which is what we used to have. Personally, at the moment, I would favour a more graduated approach, because we still don't know where we're going with this COVID thing. But I think that, we are planning on opening up. But in the sort of more long term, we've got big plans, to massively eat into our backlog and start processing a lot more material. So there's funding out there which would enable us to do this, because having just one archivist, just myself, is difficult to really do everything. It's very difficult to make decent, significant inroads into the backlog. Whereas if we were able to take on one or two more, at least for, say, a significant amount of time, we can make decent inroads into our backlog. And I spend a lot of my time talking to potential donors and actual donors. So, it's a part of the job that I really enjoy, because you're talking to real people, not just dealing with dry documents. But
have you seen a rise in approaches about material post?
Yeah, I've been getting a steady stream of inquiries throughout the whole of lockdown. It might be because people are probably at home more, thinking, what shall I do with the stuff in my loft? That
clearing out their attic. Exactly. Yes. I'm working on a piece for the Board of Deputies right now, because they've got their hidden treasures project. And Don Waterman was like, I keep getting people asking me what they should do with this stuff, and what if it's, is it worth keeping? What do I keep? What don't I keep? How do I keep it? Should I? What if I just glue everything into a notebook? We can help with this. No, don't glue it into a notebook. Please don't glue it into a notebook.
Send someone round quickly. Yeah,
absolutely.